All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. I know it's always a little bit hard to come back after a long weekend, but the good news is that this is the last time you and I will be meeting this semester. I'm a little bit sad about that. I am excited for you all because I see public speaking as a lifelong skill, and so even though this is the last time you and I will be meeting, I'm hoping that you'll take some of the lessons you've learned from this semester and keep practicing them, keep applying them. Now, I told you when I set up the syllabus for this course that I wanted it to be history and theory of public speaking in addition to practice of public speaking. So for the last 15 weeks, you've been getting a lot of history and theory from me and doing a lot of practice of public speaking in lab. Part of that history and theory of public speaking deals with time as well, and not just looking at public speaking history as theories have developed over the last 2,500 years, but looking at how the field of speech or the field of communication have developed over time. So we're going to spend our time today taking kind of a broad historical look at how communication developed in order to see that public speaking is not the vast majority of what people in communication still do. Now, I told you last week that there's a little bit of curse of teaching public speaking as long as I have. And that curse had to do with ceremonial speaking. Does anybody remember what that curse happened to be? The challenge that I have after grading a whole bunch of speeches as it relates to ceremonial speaking? Yeah. Yeah, so one of the big curses of teaching public speaking as long as I have is that any time I am at a ceremonial event where there's a ceremonial speech going on, I've graded about 2,600 speeches over the course of the last 8.5 years. When someone starts talking, my brain goes into grading mode. It's very hard for me to turn that off. There are two other big curses that come with teaching public speaking, the way that it's taught, especially at most American universities. And the first one has to do with what you'll see up on the left here, and that is, if you'll remember back to my welcome video, because we all didn't meet face-to-face the first week of class, I talked a little bit about this famous quotation from Jerry Seinfeld where he talks about people's fears. And he says that when people are afraid of things, their number one fear is public speaking and their number two fear is death. And he says it's so strange that if we're at a funeral that we'd rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. Now, the challenge that comes with teaching public speaking, especially if we teach it as what we call the basic course in communication, is that a lot of people really walk into public speaking before they even get to class. They're already expecting, ugh, I don't like public speaking. Why do I have to do this for 15 or 16 weeks? I don't want to learn. I don't want to do it. And I ask people often why they're here on the first day of class, and usually the number one answer, if I pull up Family Feud style, is the number one answer is it's required. So already walking in on the first day of class, I and your lab instructors are at a disadvantage because a lot of people don't want to be here. And if this is the only class that students get in communication, they probably already associate some of their negative feelings about public speaking with the communication discipline as a whole. My hope is that over the last 15 weeks, even if you're here only because it's required, even if it hasn't always been the most fun experience for you, is that you've at least learned some things. It's at least rewarding for you in particular ways, and you might have skills that you can continue to develop. I see public speaking as a lifelong skill. I don't think it's something that you just spend 15 or 16 weeks as an undergrad learning and then you're done with it forever and you never do it again. If you read the last chapter of your textbook, I talk in there about how I want you to continue to find and develop your voice. So you're going to give speeches that are not always as formal or sometimes more formal than the speeches you're giving in class. In order to do well on those speeches, I want you to at least pick up some of the skills that you've had in here and maybe go back to revisiting some of your notes from this class maybe 20 or 30 years down the line. Now, another curse of teaching public speaking, the way that I've taught it, the way that a lot of people teach it at most American universities, is if it's the only class that people take, some people think public speaking is easy. Maybe you get an A in public speaking and you're like, oh, well, I got an A in public speaking and I didn't think I was going to. The rest of the classes must be really easy as well. You might remember when we talked about Techne speeches, I pulled up a clip from The Simpsons where the football player here had broken his leg trying to kick a field goal, and they ask him what's his major, and he says communication, and the doctor looks horrified, and he responds, Lubchenko learned nothing. It's a phony major, right? This is another thing that we've been fighting against in the communication field for the last 2,500 years. A lot of people think that communication classes are easy. They think communication is a slacker major. I'll tell you that I double majored as an undergrad, and my communication classes were harder than most of the classes I took in physics or chemistry or biology. And the reason for that is because in physics or chemistry or biology, there are usually right or wrong answers. When I was taking communication classes, oftentimes we had to make arguments, and the quality of those arguments rested on the evidence and reasoning that we were able to provide, knowing that there was alternative evidence and alternative reasoning out there. It's not always as easy to think abstractly. It's not always easy to build arguments. So the communication scholars have been fighting everybody else for the last 2,500 years about whether and to what extent speech or communication is a worthy field of study. When we talked about your techne speeches, I told you that Plato was the one who coined the term rhetoric. And as he coined the term rhetoric in the Gorgias, what he said is that rhetoric is not a techne. That is, rhetoric is not a valid field of study. It's more like a hobby. It's more like a knack that you'd pick up. It doesn't really have any inherent value. People who study it aren't all that ethical. They have skills, but those skills also exist elsewhere. And so he said that it wasn't really a good idea to spend your time studying speech or rhetoric or persuasion, and instead you should only use speech or rhetoric or persuasion when you have the truth and you know that you are 100% right and everyone else is wrong, to use rhetoric and persuasion to get people closer to that truth that you have. Rhetoric historically has questioned whether truth exists or whether truth as it exists is something that we can know. And there have been a lot of times where people like Plato have been in favor and they've said there's no value to studying speech, there's no value to studying communication, they shouldn't offer it at the university, people shouldn't pick it up as a life skill that they use in their jobs, and so it's kind of these bottom moments on the sine wave I have here. There are other moments when speech is very much in favor, and people say it's absolutely essential to the health of our democracy, to the health of our civic life, to the health of our individual lives, insofar as we want to have upward economic and social mobility. So if you were to graph the rise and fall of interest in speech and communication over time, you could find times where there are high times for speech and there's a lot of theory, there's a lot of use and practice of speech, and people take speech seriously, and those times usually coincide with good times for democracy. The times when people say speech is not so important, we should suppress speech, we should limit it just to the canon of style and forget all the rest of it, and it's just mere rhetoric, it's just empty rhetoric, we should suppress speech, those are usually bad times for democracy. And over time, in different places, there have been lots of people rising and falling about how much value speech has or should have. Now, if I were to ask you, if you were to study speech or communication at an American university, when do you think the first time the field of communication existed was? Go ahead and raise your hand. Give me a year of when you think the first university offered a department of speech or communication. Anybody want to guess? Give me a year. Yeah. 1972, so it's been around maybe 45 years. Anybody want to guess earlier than that? Think about how old the country is. Let's take a couple more guesses. I'll tell you that one's not correct. I'm not interested in judging whether your answer is right or wrong. When do you think the first communication department existed in the United States? Take two more guesses. I know it's hard coming back after Thanksgiving. Go ahead. 1950s? What do you guess earlier than that? 1780s. So we've guessed either it's fairly recent or it's really old. The correct answer is it's somewhere in between the two. It's actually none of those. It's not 1972, it's not 1950, it's not the 1780s. There is a correct answer, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the reason why it's in the middle of those guesses is because historically, if you were to study speeches up until a particular moment in time in the United States at a university, you would have to study speeches in an English department. So Aristotle gave us the rhetoric, which deals a lot with nonfiction. It's where we've gotten a lot of our theory for this course, the 5 canons, ethos, pathos, and logos, a little bit of stasis theory. That's all in the rhetoric. Aristotle had another great work called the Poetics, and that one deals a lot with literature. It deals a lot with big epic stories of literature. So this is where you might use Greek traditions like the Iliad and the Odyssey to analyze what constitutes a good book, a good novel, a good play. And historically, since Aristotle made the division between the rhetoric and the poetics, a lot of people have said there are two separate categories. There's fiction and there's nonfiction, and neither shall they meet. So rhetoric dealt with nonfiction, poetics dealt with fiction. I took an entire grad seminar that said those distinctions are kind of arbitrary, and every act of fiction also includes some nonfiction and vice versa. Nevertheless, if you were studying speeches up until a particular moment in time, you had to do that under an English department. And there were only a couple English departments in the country that would even let you do that. It wasn't until 1914 that there was a bitter divorce that led to the creation of departments that would allow you to study speech and communication as their primary objects of study. What happened is that there were a bunch of public speaking instructors, people just like me, who were working in English departments at universities, and they were treated like second-class citizens. So they were not taken seriously by their colleagues because they weren't studying the great canonical works of literature. We were the gatekeepers, and those people over there, we don't really know what they do. They're kind of crazy. They were teaching things like elocution. I kid you not, there were all these manuals that you can look up that said, when you move into your first main point, you gesture like this. And then when you move into your second main point, it's another grand gesture like that. There were people studying elocution, and the people studying literature in English departments, or the people studying composition in English departments said, those people over there, they're a little crazy. Let's not give them what they want in terms of resources. Let's not let them teach the classes they want to teach. Let's not really treat them as if they're our equals. And what happened is there's an organization that still exists today called the National Council of Teachers of English. It's a similar organization to MLA. If you're in an English department, you will go to the NCTE page for resources. I think they still have conferences. For the most part, English departments have merged into the MLA, or the Modern Languages Association. But they used to have a big meeting of the National Council of Teachers of English. And the public speaking teachers got together at that meeting in 1914, and they said, enough. We're tired of being treated like second-class citizens, and you might not believe this, but they actually stormed out of the conference. They were so mad that they stormed out of the conference, not knowing if they would have jobs, not knowing if other universities would still keep them on, not knowing if they could do what they wanted to do. But what they wanted to do was to create their own association, the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking. And so they got together and they decided that they were going to make this organization. And they were going to make a case for why public speaking should exist at the university level. And if it does exist at the university level, why should it exist as its own department? And they took a big risk by doing this. And what happened is that their case was taken up, and it mostly caught on in the Midwest. So Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. Or it caught on in the deep south, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi. What happened is that they made a case for why public speaking was necessary at the university level. And to this day, if you were to go to any of the Ivy League institutions, so Harvard or Yale or Princeton, if you're going to go to an Ivy League institution, you will not find a Department of Communication there. The people at those institutions in the English department said, okay, you want to leave? We don't see a need for you. But in the Midwest and in the South, and at mostly land-grant institutions, so public universities given public lands by the Land Grant Act, other public universities like UND, said, we actually do see a need for speech and communication at the university level. We see a couple needs for that. One is that the Land Grant Act, as it was designed, created one university in every state that was supposed to build up people who otherwise didn't have access to education. It was mostly designed for people on farms and people in the military. And they said, you know, these people who historically haven't had much access to education are still doing really important things. We all need food, we all need security. Those people should be able to learn how to give a good speech. They should learn so that they can have upward economic mobility, and maybe if they want to leave the farm or leave the military, to move to cities or to move to other places where they can find work. But also, we want them to be able to advocate on behalf of their farms. We want them to advocate on behalf of the military. We want them to have a voice in our democracy where otherwise they've been disenfranchised. Part of why I like teaching and directing public speaking at public universities is because I was trained under 3 land-grant institutions, and I think it's important that you all learn to have your own voices and to make your own voices heard. Now, there are a lot of other places that still, to this day, say there isn't really much of a need for that. But at least at UND, while you all are here, part of why UND wants so many of you to take public speaking, why it is required for so many of you, is because a lot of people aren't very good at it, and they want you to be able to develop skills to be able to do it better, and that aligns pretty well with my values. So how did people go about studying speech? Well, from 1914 up until the 1960s, there was pretty much one way to teach and research and publish books about public speaking. And that was to look toward the great works. So the colleagues that they broke away from in English were still studying the great works of literature. They decided they were going to study what they thought were the great works of speech. And oftentimes what that meant is they were looking for what Cato the Elder has called a good person or a good man speaking well. And oftentimes what that meant is that they would study figures like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln. They would study famous men, usually world leaders, usually famous white men, usually the US presidency. And they would say, well, these people made careers for themselves, and part of why they were able to get to the highest office in the land, and maybe the highest office in the world, is through speech. They were successful. These were good speakers. They gave some of the most notable speeches in US history. The Gettysburg Address, the fireside chats, whatever it happened to be, they were able to make a living for themselves, and part of that had to do with their good speaking abilities. So if we're going to teach people how to speak well, we're going to study these examples. We're going to have our students do exercises in classes where they read those speeches, analyze those speeches, try to figure out what's good about those speeches, try to emulate those speeches, sometimes even try to practice delivering those speeches in order to show people what constituted a good speech. Now that model worked out pretty well for about the next 50 years. A lot of people who broke away from the NCTE and some of their students who then became professors worked under that model, and that model worked pretty well until it didn't work so well anymore. And a bunch of social factors started happening in the 1960s that said, you know what, this model isn't really working out all that well. One of those models is, as you might imagine, if the version of Cato the Elder's good person speaking well meant that you only studied presidents, and oftentimes dead presidents, there were only certain speeches that you looked at, and only certain speeches that you held up as the models of good speeches. And it started to become the case that more people were getting access to education who didn't look so much like US presidents. So maybe they come from poor backgrounds. Maybe they're women. Maybe they are people of color. Whatever it happens to be, those models pulled from Jefferson and Washington and Lincoln, those models aren't holding up to the realities that are going on the ground. We have all these models from Aristotle and from Cicero and from people around their times talking about what constitutes a good speech, and most of the time when they're talking about what makes a good speech, it's an old dead white guy telling us what they think constitutes a good speech. And that old dead white guy model of speech often centers on this model of civility. You have to participate in a way that is civil. And what happened around the 1960s is we get the women's rights movement, we get the civil rights movement, we get the anti-war movement, and those models of civility and public dialogue and deliberation that were coming out of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Europe, those models weren't really explaining those movements all that well. Those movements were loud. Those movements were oftentimes angry. Those movements oftentimes didn't have a single speaker addressing a large audience, but oftentimes many speakers operating simultaneously. Those people speaking were not traditionally the people who were allowed to speak. It wasn't just the leaders, usually white men of power, but it was women, it was black men, it was Latino men, it was Latino women starting to speak. And they said these models that we've been using for the last 2,400 years don't explain what's going on the ground. And who is telling these professors that they're wrong? It's not the professors telling each other that they're wrong. It's coming from their students. The students are saying, yeah, we like learning about Aristotle, yeah, we like learning about Cicero, but we really want to study Martin Luther King. We really want to study Gloria Steinem. We really want to study Malcolm X. And your theories don't account for what's going on outside of the walls of the ivory tower. Look beyond the walls of your classroom and you will see that we need new theories of communication because the models that we've been using for the last 2,500 years don't exactly describe our current moment. There's another critique that happens around the same time. Historically, speeches were usually given by the medium of speech. It was usually a speaker speaking at a podium to a large audience. The medium that they were speaking to their audience was air. But we started to see even in the 1920s and 30s people using radio for speech. And then radio became television. Television became music. Music became movies. And there were a lot of people who wanted to study speech, but also were interested in the other ways that these things that were not speech functioned like speech. If we have these theories for what constitutes a good speech or how communication works, can we take some of those theories and apply them to things like the Brady Bunch? Can we apply them to things like Woody Guthrie songs? Can we apply them to movies? And if so, what do we learn from that? We're not just studying speeches anymore, but we're using theories that we've used to study speech to study other things. So we see a proliferation not just of speakers and types of speech and the settings in which you might speak, social movements, but also a proliferation of media. There's a lot of ways that messages get out that are not just one speaker speaking to an audience and the audience deciding whether that's a good speech or not such a good speech. There's a third critique that comes out right around the same time. In 1965, there was a rhetorician named Ed Black. He was a very famous rhetorician in the 20th century. He advised some people who are close to me, who helped advise me. Ed Black writes a book in 1965 called Rhetorical Criticism, A Study in Method. And his argument in that book is that we're not just studying a bunch of old dead white guys. We're not just not able to account for social movements or new media. But the way that we were studying speeches, oftentimes the criteria for how we determined what a good speech was based on what the speaker intended. That is, do they have good intentions? Are they good people? Or based on effect. Does the speech resonate? Does it move the audience to do something? Does it get the audience to not do something? So if FDR is worried that if everybody draws money out of the banks because they're afraid the economy is going to tank, he says in one of his fireside chats that if you all go and withdraw your money from the banks are going to fail and you're going to be worse off. And you might guess that that speech actually worked pretty well. FDR gave that speech over the radio, and a lot of people second-guessed whether they were going to take money out of the banks during the Depression. And that actually helped. So up until 1965, there were a lot of people talking about great models and great moments from history that were based on what the speaker intended. Are they a good person? And whether their speech had an effect. Did they speak well? Did they get their message across? Did they say it in the right time, in the right place, in the right way? And Ed Black takes a big issue with this. And he takes issue with it because he says those are not the only models for what constitutes a good speech. So we're going to watch a clip from Dead Poets Society. This is Robin Williams. It is not Ed Black up here. I imagine, though, that if Ed Black were teaching an undergraduate seminar or graduate seminar in the late 1960s or early 1970s, his graduate seminar would have looked a lot like the scene you're about to see.
Page 21 of the introduction. Perry, you read the opening paragraph of the preface. Entitled Understanding Poetry. Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
I'm going to pause it there for a second. I imagine that if Ed Black were teaching a class, or more importantly, if Ed Black's colleagues were teaching a class prior to 1965, what they would have would look a lot like this. But instead of perfection being mapped out on the x-axis, we would have intent. Instead of importance being mapped out on the y-axis, we would have effect. Now, if any of you have taken calculus, you know that you can measure the area under various curves, and you can calculate the total area, and that'll give you a value. And so what they're saying is, if they're evaluating poetry in this case, if we can measure a poem's perfection on one axis and its importance on the other, then we can figure out how great that poem is by multiplying that perfection scale by that importance scale. Similarly, I don't think they would map it out in calculus terms, but similarly, if rhetoricians were teaching public speaking classes in the 1950s and 60s, they wouldn't map it out like this, but they would try to figure out a speech's greatness by how good its intent was or how good its effect was. Now, think about why that might be a good or bad thing. How would you know if a speech is great under those criteria, if those are your criteria? Now, a lot of people who were studying speeches at that time said, this is how you study what constitutes a great speech. A good person speaking well, we can measure that by intent and effect. Here's what Robin Williams thinks of it, and here's what Ed Black would probably think of that.
Excellent. That's what I take Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. I'm not laying pipe. We're talking about poetry. How could you describe poetry like American Bandstand? Well, I like Byron, I give him a 42, but I can't dance to it. I want you to rip out that page. Go on. Rip out the entire page. Here, rip it out. Rip it out. Come on, rip it out. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, not just tear out that page, tear out the entire introduction. I want it gone. History. Leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Rip! Be gone, J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. Rip! Shred! Tear! Rip it out! I want to hear nothing but ripping of Mr. Pritchard. We'll preparate it. Put it on a roll.
Now, why does Robin Williams' character here, or Ed Black, get so upset about trying to treat poetry as if it's calculus? What's the problem, or what are some problems that they might have with trying to measure a speech's greatness based on how good the speaker's intentions were or whether the speech had an effect on its audience? What might be some problems there? Yeah. Go ahead. In the back. Okay. So I think what you're saying is it's subjective. In other words, if I rate a poem a 2 and somebody else rates it a 4, we then have to have an argument over whether it's a 2, a 4, a 3, or a 9. Okay, so different people might rate intent or effect or importance or perfection differently. Are there other problems that you could see with this? Why might this upset someone like Ed Black so much? Yeah?
Poetry is just a form of art. You can't measure art.
Yeah, so poetry is an art. You're trying to turn it into a science by quantifying it. We're taking something that's inherently qualitative, it's a value judgment. We're trying to assign a number to it, but that number might not actually reflect that art all that well. Can you think of any other problems that might exist with this? I know it's hard after Thanksgiving. See if we can get one more. Okay, you all are pretty quiet. I'll go ahead and jump in. Another problem with this is it's not always clear how you would go about measuring someone's intent. Can you ever know if you're not in someone else's head whether they have good intentions? How often is it the case where somebody makes a joke and you think it's offensive and they say, well, that's not what I meant? Or maybe you are operating under a presumption of rationality and that other person is mentally ill, like Vincent van Gogh. So you may not be able to know someone's intent. Similarly, you might not always be able to measure effect. Sometimes we measure effect quantitatively by how many people change their minds, if we have public opinion polls, or how many people do or don't engage in the behavior that the speaker allegedly wants them to do in the speech. But we can't always know a person's intent, and we can't always measure the effect that it has on an audience. Now, to make this point, Ed Black turns to a particular speech given by a man named John J. Chapman. Chapman was an abolitionist. He was against slavery, and he happened to give a speech in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is about 45 minutes to an hour outside of Philly. And he gives this speech, and Ed Black reads the speech. He's teaching at Penn State. He goes to the archives in Coatesville. He digs up this speech, and he stumbles upon it, and he says, this is brilliant. He said the speech is incredibly moral. It's way ahead of its time. It's brilliant. The problem that Black has with this speech is that Chapman delivered it in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, in a barn. You know how many people were in his audience? 3. So Ed Black says, Chapman gives this brilliant speech, but nobody's around to hear it. It's kind of like if a tree falls in the forest and doesn't make a sound. He's asking, if the speech had no effect, how do we know that it's not a good speech? When somebody like Hitler has a large effect, but we could say lots of things about Hitler's intentions, and we could say that Hitler's intentions are not so good, we're much more likely to study someone like Hitler. We're much less likely to study someone like Chapman. But it gets even weirder than that. Black's reading this speech. He's doing some biographical work on Chapman. What does he learn? At the time that Chapman gives this speech, he's an abolitionist. Later in his life, he turns back on that and becomes pretty racist. He probably becomes what we would today call a white supremacist. So Chapman's intent in this particular moment that he gave this speech might have been good, but over time, his legacy is kind of tainted by the fact that he changed his mind on slavery or changed his mind about racism. It's complicated, and so even if we can know someone's intent, and Black would argue in most cases we can't, intent is not something that's always stable. Effect isn't always something that's grand. We can't always know it. And so for the 50 years following this, Ed Black has this critique and says we can't really study intent, we can't really study effect, and therefore we have to find new methods of studying what constitutes a great speech. Now Black is responding, probably not directly, to one of the other models that we've talked about in this course. And so you might guess that that's going to turn into our participation question, your last one for the semester. You can go ahead and log into Blackboard. I've put up a couple of different theories that we've talked about this semester on the screen here. And my question to you is, in his critique of intent and effect, which communication theory was Ed Black most concerned about? Maybe it's the 5 canons, maybe it's the communication model, maybe it's the rhetorical situation, maybe it's the pistes or modes of proof, ethos, pathos, and logos. I want you to try and figure out, he's maybe not responding to one of these directly, but there's one answer here that he would probably be pretty concerned about. I'm less concerned about whether you get the right or wrong answer today, but this is the kind of question that could pop up on the final exam that you would take in lab in a couple of weeks. So I share this with you right after Thanksgiving, toward the end of the semester, looking backwards comprehensively, because that final exam will be comprehensive, trying to get you to engage in some critical thinking. So try and get to the right answer. You may or may not get it today. If you kind of recognize these theories and you're not really sure what the right answer is or why, you'll probably want to do some reviewing before your final exam. So you can go ahead and log into Blackboard. We are in week 15. As always, if you have trouble logging into Blackboard or trouble submitting your answer, you can go ahead and email that to your lab instructor. And you might not be finished yet, but I'm curious to take a pulse of the room, so please raise your hands. How many of you think the answer is A? Nobody in here thinks the answer is A? Spent a lot of time talking about the 5 canons. Anybody think B? Raise your hands. 2, 4 of you. How many of you think C? Okay, a lot of you. How many of you think D? A lot of you as well. So we're pretty torn on this question. A lot of you chose C, a lot of you chose D, very few of you chose A or B. I'll tell you that a lot of you got this answer wrong. And I don't say that to scare you, although I kind of want to scare you a little bit. That's a little fun for me to get you all to review. But I'll tell you that a lot of you got the wrong answer here. A lot of you chose the rhetorical situation. I could see that being possibly a valid answer. If you remember the parts of the rhetorical situation, I'm not going to do a pop quiz here right now, because a lot of you would probably not do so well on that pop quiz right after Thanksgiving. If I were to do a pop quiz, the three parts of Lloyd Bitzer's rhetorical situation are an exigence, the audience, and constraints. I could maybe see an argument for how both intent and effect are tied up in an exigence. If an exigence is an imperfection marked by urgency, if it's some kind of problem the speaker is trying to fix, we could maybe see how there would be some intent of what the speaker is trying to do. We could maybe see how there's some effect on an audience. There's something there, so I can see why that would probably be one of your answers. I'm not going to try and trick you with questions that have more than one right or wrong answer, but there's a much better answer up here. Now, a lot of you also said D, the pistes, ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos being a person's perceived character, pathos being the emotions they're trying to project, logos being the rationality or the logic that they're using. Also not the correct answer. The correct answer, a handful of you raised your hand for, and the correct answer is the model that you see up here. Which model is that? The communication model. Somebody who said that the correct answer was B, if you're comfortable in being brave, why would you say that Ed Black is concerned with the communication model when he's critiquing intent and effect? Anybody want to try and answer that? Okay, it's okay if you don't. I recognize it's a little uncomfortable responding in front of 300 people. But the reason why B is the better answer here, the communication model, is because when the communication model functions properly, a speaker encodes a message. They have a particular intent. They're trying to get that message across to the receiver. The receiver decodes that message, and if that message is transmitted correctly from a source through a channel to a receiver, then that receiver hypothetically is compelled to do what the speaker wants them to do. They're supposed to act in the way that the speaker intended. The message is supposed to have an effect upon the receiver. So Ed Black is saying it's really hard for us to try and figure out what a source's intent is. In a lot of cases, we can't necessarily know what the source's intention is, and sometimes even if we think we know it, they have some plausible deniability in saying, well, that's not what I meant. How dare you get offended, receiver? I didn't mean that at all. Sometimes a source encodes a message and they think they encode it really well, and the receiver's not yet ready to hear it. And so it doesn't really have much of an effect or any effect on the receiver. So this was the model that really has been holding for the last 50 years or so in speech, in rhetoric, in communication. A lot of people say you can't study intent, you can't study effect, and if you do, you have to find these weird ways around it because we can't always know what a person's intent is. Now, I remember being in a graduate school, seminar and talking about Ed Black's piece on the Coatesville Address, and a lot of us were ripping apart intent and saying all the things you said about how you can't quantify it or you can't know it. And my professor, Steve Brown, who, if I remember correctly, was trained by Ed Black or at least knew Ed Black, said, okay, I see where you're coming from. But if you imagine a speech like a dog, think about a speech as a dog. If you get rid of intent, it's kind of like chopping off the head. If you get rid of effect, it's kind of like chopping off the tail. So Brown said to us, what are you left with when you get rid of intent and effect? What are you left with when you have only the dog's body and the dog's legs? So you get the worst parts of the dog. You don't get to know how the dog is expressive. You don't get to know if the dog is happy or sad. You don't get to play with the dog. You're just stuck. And he was saying that if we treat speech like this dog that has no head and has no tail, there's not a whole lot about speech that isn't intent or effect. If we're studying speeches in context, sometimes we need a concept of intent or a concept of effect or both in order to understand what that speech is doing and why it matters. What wags the dog? So you see, even 50 years after Ed Black publishes his book Critiquing Intent and Effect, you're seeing a resurgence of studies of those things. So just 3 years ago, Amos Kive, who I'm friends with, and Davis Houck published a book where they called the book The Effects of Rhetoric and the Rhetoric of Effects. And they started from the premise of Ed Black's rhetorical criticism and said, okay, if we can't talk about effect, we still talk about things like audience reception. We still talk about things like influence. There are lots of other ways that we can understand speech or non-speech as effect or more than effect. It would not surprise me if in the next couple of years there was a similar book that comes out that is the intents of rhetoric and the rhetoric of intents. So we might say we can do away with intent and effect, but we never really quite get there. Nevertheless, speech is kind of a difficult subject to study, and there are a lot of people like me who teach and study public speaking who have a tendency to overthink these kinds of things. And there are lots of people in communication studies who still do study speech. There was one more critique that started developing in the 60s and 70s, and that critique is that speech and communication developed out of public speaking instructors being kind of angry and storming out of the NCTE and forming their own fields or majors at their universities. There are a bunch of people who are trained in the humanities or the arts like me who study rhetoric from an artistic kind of perspective. But at the same time that the media were expanding to things like radio and television and movies, what we started to see were social scientists, especially after World War II, coming about and saying, you know, you all are over there studying humanities as if it's philosophy. We want to study it as if it's sociology, as if it's political science, as if it's one of the other social sciences. So they started doing empirical studies of how persuasion worked. They started doing surveys. They started doing interviews. They started doing case studies. And they were trying to figure out how communication operated. So the organization that started as the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking morphed into the Speech Communication Association. So there were still people studying speech. There were still people studying communication. So they decided to call the major speech communication. And there are still quite a few universities that teach communication under that umbrella term. But later on, a lot of people said, we don't do anything with speech. And they actually got annoyed with themselves and they said, you know, we're going to get rid of this term speech. So the Speech Communication Association is now called the National Communication Association. I happen to know a story of people showing up when they had the vote to change the name from Speech to National Communication Association, and people showed up at the convention that year wearing shirts that said speechless. So there's a long history of speech and communication being really bound up with one another. That history is starting to change. And so what you see now in the 21st century is the National Communication Association being this very broad umbrella organization. There's lots of people in communication studies who teach public speaking and other subjects all over the country. I just went to the National Communication Association convention a couple weeks ago. At that convention, there are 48 different divisions. There are people like me who study rhetoric and public address and public speaking. There are people who study culture. There are people who study American studies. There are people in various identity groups like the LGBTQ caucus or the Black caucus. There are people there who do mass communication. There are people there who do political communication, visual communication, family communication, interpersonal communication, small group communication. And what happens is now that we have 48 different divisions, a lot of those people study something that they call communication, but they study a lot of different objects of study, and they study them from very different methodologies. Some are humanists who are trained to see communication more like an art. Some are social scientists. Some are critical. They study communication in a variety of different ways, and it's often the case that somebody in one of those divisions doesn't really understand what half of the other ones do, or why someone would study that. So up until I came to UND, I hadn't met someone who studied PR or advertising. That's about the opposite of what I do. I now have two colleagues who do public relations and advertising as their research. So what happened is, as the umbrella expanded beyond speech and we had different objects of study and different methodologies, communication has undergone a perpetual identity crisis. There are lots of people in the field who make arguments in some of our top scholarly peer-reviewed journals that say, we're getting too big, we're getting too divisive. I don't understand what those people do over there or why they would do it. And so they say, we need to get smaller, we need to figure out what it is that unites us, or we're going to get axed. Different universities are going to cut our departments and say, we don't really understand what you do. But then there's always a response to that. This has happened 3 or 4 times in our top journals. There's always a response to that that says, yeah, but if you're going to cut people, who are you going to cut? The family communication people are making really interesting ideas about how families work and how to do family therapy. The rhetoricians are still talking about how politics operates. The organizational communication people are talking about how teams function at work. We can't really cut anybody, because if we start cutting people, they're not going to have jobs, and their research that's still pretty important is going to get cut. So the perpetual question, perpetual crisis, is whether the umbrella of communication studies is big enough to hold, despite those different divisions. And the one thing that usually holds it together is that most people in communication studies study how communication gets people to unite and see themselves as one and the same, or how we divide ourselves up and say we are different from you, and that's a big that matters. So in the 21st century, a lot of you are taking public speaking because it's a required class and it's your only interaction with communication studies. I want to talk to you all to get you to see that communication has a lot more to offer, and there's a lot more to offer not just in the field, but also here at UND and also for some of you in your own careers. I mentioned that NCA has 48 different divisions. I happen to be a member of a couple different divisions that have to do with civic and community engagement, rhetorical theory. There's even a division for people who teach and study what we call the basic course. We get together and different public speaking directors from across the country say what's working and what's not working in our curriculum. But there's a lot of other divisions that might interest some of you. Some of them are new. Communication and sports only been around a few years. There's an economic communication division that just started. Mass communication, public relations. I also want to share with you that even if you're not going to take other classes here at UND, I want you to understand what it is that UND has to offer and what the field has to offer more broadly. So at UND, I'm the only one who comes from a humanistic tradition. I'm the only one who studies rhetoric. But if you take upper level classes, you're not going to be taking public speaking. You're going to be taking things like advertising, journalism, media studies, social media strategy. Those are all things that employers want to see. I've seen a lot of studies that say employers rank communication as the single most important skill. So a lot of you might not major in communication, but you might take some of our classes. If you're interested in majoring in communication, that's something that we all can talk about. We also have a bunch of different clubs and organizations that are available on campus. In particular, if you're an advertising or PR student, we have a couple organizations that you can be a part of. Probably of most interest to most of you is that we have lots of careers and internships, and some of our former students, whether they were communication majors or not, have had internships working for the Minnesota Vikings, the Minnesota Twins, the Grand Forks Herald, the Fargo Forum, different TV news stations, different marketing agencies around Grand Forks and East Grand Forks and Fargo. So if that's something that interests you, that's something that we can talk about as well. I share all of this with you to remind you all that even though you've had one semester public speaking, your journey in public speaking, your journey in communication may not be done. I hope that you all can take the skills that you've had over the last semester and continue to use them, but I also hope that I can continue to be a resource for you. If you're interested in learning more about studying or majoring in communication, that's something we can talk about. If you've got projects for other classes or you're getting ready for a job, I want to help you with your public speaking and communication skills for those things. So this is the last meeting that we all will have this semester. You still have some other meetings in lab to finish practicing public speaking before your semester ends. But if you read the last chapter of your textbook, I don't want this to be an end, but rather a beginning. Public speaking is a lifelong skill. I want you all to continue finding your voice. So I'll leave you there.